As many of you know, I'm Megan Doherty, Director of the Museum of the White Mountains. It's great to have you all with us today. As we gather, we're all on Indigenous lands. As I sit in my office at the museum, I'm on Indakina, which is the ancestral and present homelands of the Abenaki and Wabanaki peoples. I'm grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waterways. For those of you not joining from Plymouth today, we've put some links in the chat where you can learn more about the Indigenous histories of your place at native-land.ca, as well as the Abenaki peoples of Northern New England through the Musée des Abenaki in Quebec. Thank you for joining us for the first of this semester's Tree Talks. These talks extend the conversations we've been having with Eden Bowditch, faculty here at PSU, and a wonderful group of students, some of you who I see joining us today, as we prepare for an exhibition later this fall. This project, Rooted: A Story of Trees, began with a conversation between Eden and myself about how to bring more visibility to the Adopt a Tree program, which raises funds to support the care of PSU's amazing collection of trees. When Eden put together a dream list of speakers to go along with the exhibition, today's guest was at the top of the list. Not only had Eden identified 12 trees on campus around which to focus the fundraising efforts, but I also already knew Dan from a long ago fellowship at the Huntington Library, so he seemed the perfect choice for our first event. Dan Lewis is the Huntington Library Senior Curator for the History of Science and Technology, and 12 Trees: The Deep Roots of Our Future is his fourth book. It's a story about transformation and survival in the face of a planet confronting the most rapid environmental changes in human history, told through 12 trees from around the world. I'm so grateful for Dan for saying yes and joining us from the West Coast today. Please join me in welcoming Dan Lewis. We'll silently clap. Thanks, Dan.
Megan, thank you so much. Hi, friends. I'm delighted to be here. I hope you can hear me okay. I worked on this book. This was really my pandemic project in significant ways. And, I'm interested in trees. I'm interested in a lot of things. The natural world is full of all sorts of remarkable, idiosyncratic, and fascinating elements. And trees certainly, are among the most visible, though. I think it's one way to think about it. The slide up right now shows the cover of the tree as it was issued in hardcover and then paperback. One thing you wouldn't necessarily know is those trees in the background running around the middle of the book are 11 of the 12 trees in the book. There's one tree, it's a tree known only from the fossil record, Eminea protera, that doesn't show up on that list, or at least in that graphic of the trees. The center image is the European edition, which came out on July 4th, which I found satisfying, of last year. And they've changed the subtitle, but I get asked, did they change the spelling to match British spellings? And so no, trunk is not boot, and wrench is not spanner. Although I don't think I mentioned trunks or wrenches in the course of the book anywhere. And then on the right is the Chinese translation, which was for the Taiwan market, which came out, I don't know how long it's been on now, maybe a couple of months. So I'm delighted to have eyes on it in other parts of the world. I will say, I'm interested in trees, but I'm interested in the whole research and writing and publishing world. And so if you have any particular questions about any aspect of those elements of the book, I'm glad to address them, and I'll try not to go on too long about them. The other thing that I have done that's been useful for this project is I'm a member of the Species Survival Commission for the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is the world's largest peer scientific group of people. It's not a conservation group in that no one sends them money, but their job is to try to understand the threats to different species of all kinds around the world. So they're really engaging work and important thing. I want to say a little bit about the artist who did the cover. He's an illustrator. He's a professor of illustration at the Art Center College of Design, where I am on the faculty. I'm also on the faculty at Caltech, and I make them read all sorts of things out of my different books. But Eric and I met for at least 3 years after I recruited him to do this book, and then the internal illustrations for the book, which I will discuss, which I'll show you as we go through my talk. Eric had the wrong day for the book party, so he never showed up. I was sitting on a coffee shop in Pasadena with my wife a couple months ago, and somebody walked up to me, and I had my Huntington work badge on for some reason. And he walked up and said, "Are you Dan Lewis?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'm Eric Nyquist." And we hugged, even though we never met. And Eric solicited, Eric offered 72 versions of the cover to my editor at Simon Schuster, which I found faintly appalling as well as admirable. He's really a renowned illustrator. I felt very fortunate to him. He has done a lot of different things. Here's a flavor of some of his other work. He's shown up in every possible venue, but he has a particular interest, I think, in illustrating aspects of the natural world. And so he shows up here. His funniest one is the illustration that he was asked to do for the New Yorker for that really hideous movie, Cocaine Bear. If any of you saw it, I somehow forced myself to sit through it. It's absolutely awful, which perhaps is its only redeeming value, is the fact that it's so awful. He said that he was given 48 hours to do this illustration by the New Yorker, and he did. So it makes me laugh. Okay, so let me work my way through these 12 trees. And then I have an epilogue that I think is a useful way to wrap up the topic at hand. The bristlecone pine, my eye, because it's such an iconic tree in some ways. And, it really is important because it's a survivor. And I think being a survivor as a tree is really one of the most essential qualities we can have in a really, what really is an environmentally challenging world. Environmental in the sense of the climate and weather conditions and ground conditions, and so. And this title is intentionally a little bit provocative because the Bible, as you perhaps know, notes that the planet is 6,006 years old, according to, I think, Genesis. And of course, how do you square that with the fact that if you find a bristlecone pine that's older than 6,006 years old, where does that leave you? And I will say I wrote to maybe a half dozen theologians about this when I was starting off on the book to render an opinion about what they thought the implications might be if we found a tree this old that was reliably datable because of the tree rings and the fact that dendrochronologists can actually work their way through the tree ring by ring quite reliably to date it with exceptional precision. What would that mean? And not a one of them answered. Surprised and a little disappointed. So the bristlecone pine is not what you'd probably call an attractive tree in a traditional sense of the word. There's a concept I've become very interested in, which is the notion of charisma and why we think of things as charismatic and what we consider charismatic, as well as what we don't consider charismatic. I think that's been a hallmark for a lot of trees, is that people find them charismatic. They find something appealing about them, or ennobling, or inspirational, or any of the other cluster of things that we define as charismatic. And way more to say about that particular topic than I have time for today. Just wandering a little bit off topic. It's also very present in this a new book I'm working on right now. Say something about later on if any of you want. So Pinus longeva, also called the Great Basin bristlecone pine, can make functional cells for thousands of years. This is a shot of the tree taken in October of 1954. This is out of the Huntington's collections, as many of the images. There are no images in the book per se, other than the 12 illustrations that go with the bespoke images that go with each of the chapters. This is out of our Southern California Edison photograph and negative collection. We have an exceptional collection of these things. And of course, Edison photographers didn't just photograph electrical things, they photographed any number of other things that were in their bailiwick. And so I found the tree to be exceptional, and I think one of its greatest qualities is simply that it's a survivor. And it's really sprinkled in small stands throughout Nevada and California and Utah too. And it lives at, it's a really high elevation tree. I suspect that some of you, if not many of you, have seen one or more in your travels. Perhaps it lives generally at between 9,500 and 11,000 feet, so it's a fairly high elevation tree. And of course, it gets its name from these bristly cones, as you can see in that close-up there. One of the really fun things, I guess is the right word. I find research and writing so much fun and so engaging that it rarely isn't fun for me. And I really like to write, and the research, so it works for me. But one of the most fun things I did was I took a visit to the laboratory for tree ring research, which is in Tucson, in Arizona, and it's the largest tree ring laboratory in the world. There are probably another 100 institutions, I guess, of varying sizes that have facilities to study tree rings and to do all the things that dendrochronologists do, as people that study tree rings are called, that do in order to make sense of an extraordinary number of things. And so these tree rings can reveal climate patterns, precipitation, wind patterns, local ground effects. They even can tell you something about solar radiation in their rings because of the ways that sunlight affect the growth and the timing of these different tree rings. They have something called early wood and late wood, which are the darker and lighter bands that precede the rings that mark the changing of the year in one of the trees. And one of these are sort of still shots from my work, from my 2-day visit to the laboratory. And it's an enormous place. They have about 50 people working there, which I found really quite striking, given the fact that they are working on something very specific, right? The rings of trees. But there are a million things to be had. And I think I might take a second to read a little bit out of the book for a second, because I don't have the whole thing memorized. Although I enjoy the parlor trick of asking someone to open up the book and read a sentence and see if I can tell them what chapter it's in, because when you write a book and you go through, I went through 6 page proofs with this book. When you go through multiple page proofs, you've memorized large sections of your own work. Can't stand to listen to it as an audiobook. I like the person that read it, but it's just a little too much. So I think I made it 2/3 of the way through the book. But I want to talk about the kinds of things, if I can find it quickly, the kinds of things that you think I would have marked this sooner rather than right now. The different kinds of things that people study the tree rings for. Nothing more exciting than watching somebody read something. Might not be able to find it here. I will read a little bit from the book here. Play the Jeopardy song while I'm doing this here. One of the things, well, I can't immediately spot it. One of the things, though, that is a well-known sort of cultural episode was the fact that a grad student named Don Curry cut down bristlecone pine known as Prometheus. It was the at the time, the oldest tree known to man. And Curry found this. And the way you traditionally work out the age of a tree is you use a coring instrument that goes into the approximate center of the tree, comes out and gives a wooden core. And you can see a few of these in the image here. These, I think, are cores. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but the cores right here along the bottom here are tree ring cores. And then you can carefully count the rings. You don't have to destroy the tree. So Don Curry tried this, and it kept breaking. And so finally he decided he was going to cut it. And then went back to his hotel that night with a segment of the tree and was horrified to find that he'd cut down a tree that was then the oldest known bristlecone pine. And so Audubon magazine calls him a murderer, all sorts of things that he had a hard time outrunning for the rest of his life. I will say that there is always a silver lining for almost anything. In this case, the silver lining is now, and all the remnants of the tree are here in the tree ring lab. What you can do is you can see the entire landscape on the slab of the tree. So the analogy I make is that using those cores to study a tree is like looking through a periscope on a submarine. Studying a cut slab, the entire piece of the tree, is like looking out over a landscape. It's just an enormously different scientific and visual sort of odyssey in the things that you can learn. So there's the passage that I wanted to read you, so I'm going to keep moving. Okay, I'm already at 12 minutes, so I move on to my next tree, the coast redwood. So I picked 2 very well-known trees to start off the book. It's the tallest tree on the planet. It really inspires a lot of people in a lot of important ways, and it really is a great treasure of the tree. And perhaps you've seen them there. They live in a relatively small band of land up in the Pacific Northwest. They're magnificent. There's nothing like them on the planet. And so I'll read another bit here. It says, I say, we gather around the tree, we take photos, we mug for the camera, we grin as we pretend to try to encircle the tree with our arms. It's like taking a photo with the president. Each visitor is just one of an uncountable number of supplicants for the tree's brief attention, and it will have a life far beyond ours. There's something congregational about the redwoods and their groves. A group of worshippers, petitioners standing solemnly upright before an even higher power than themselves, the calculus of wind, rain, sun, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and time. And so I just wanted to channel the magnificence of the tree. It really is extraordinary. A lot of birds sort of fly in and out of my stories and my books, whether the book is explicitly about birds or not. And one of the most interesting stories I found related to this tree was a bird called the marbled murrelet. And it was a standing mystery for centuries as to where the marbled murrelet nested. And for a long time, it wasn't known. And in 1972, the Audubon, the organization, offered a $100 reward if anyone could find out where these birds nested. And a tree cutter working up in a big tree in a mixed grove was working around something, and he saw a nest, and there was some splotchy little creature in the nest, and he was trying to cut around it, and he accidentally dislodged it. It fell 150 feet to the ground. It was unharmed. He picked up this baby bird and took it to the nearest nature station, and they identified it, and the jig was up. I don't think this guy ever claimed the reward, so if any of you want to go out and see if you can slip the $100, I urge you to try. I thought about it myself, and I just haven't. Here's a shot of the murrelet. Brachyramphus marmoratus. The tree trimmer was a guy named Hoyt Foster, who himself had fallen out of the tree more than once and had been badly injured. And so he was once he got back in his tree, he was pretty careful about things. Okay, I'm only at chapter 3. Sorry. This is a tree that was native to the island of Rapa Nui in the Pacific, but then which the last one died essentially in around 1960, but not before seeds for the tree were rescued and taken to places, in particular Sweden and some of the botanic gardens. And so for fairly complicated botanical reasons I go into in the book, it does not grow on Rapa Nui. They can't get it to grow. And it's about the rhizomes, the mycorrhizal network between the soil and the tree roots that is not working. The soil is depleted on Rapa Nui, and so there have been numerous expeditions there to get the tree to grow. It hasn't grown. And so I found that very interesting because, extinction is one thing, but extirpation is another. And extirpation specifically means something that's gone extinct locally, even though it exists elsewhere on the planet. So these kinds of extirpations are impactful. What it means in the case of Rapa Nui, Easter Island, is that it's disappeared it's disappeared forever. Well, not forever, but for the time being, perhaps from the island. And it might as well be functionally extinct for people living on Rapa Nui, of course, because it isn't there anymore. I sort of investigate just what that's meant for people. These are the flowers of the Toromiro tree, Sophora toromiro. It's a very speciose group of trees. There are probably another 30 species scattered around the Pacific. And the other thing is certainly true that taxonomists argue constantly about whether something is a genus in the same genus or is it this species or that species. And if you are a birder, you probably heard the terms splitting and lumping, and that's certainly a strategy that happens plants as well. People, and part of that is because of the messy, humbling nature of evolution. As I tell my Caltech students when I teach on the natural sciences or the history of the natural sciences, everything is in the process of turning into something else through the pressures of natural selection and mutation and genetic drift. And they're fine enough that we can't measure them, but they are always at play. There's always some selective pressure at work. The next tree in my rogues gallery of trees is the amber. That is a tree called Hymenea, Protera hymenea. And I wanted to have a tree from deep time in the book because it's not here at all anymore. It's gone, long gone. But what has survived is this sort of cultural and scientific payload in the form of amber, of which there are many different varieties and colors, is important because for scientific purposes, for what it contains biologically. So it contains insects and insect parts. It contains plant matter. They're all small. So if aliens were to land on our planet and go to the museum and look through the amber collections in different natural history museums, they might come to the conclusion that everything was little. And this is what we call Lilliputian bias, that things that appear like they're all small, but of course they're certainly not. It's just that amber doesn't really collect things that are much bigger because amber by necessity is a relatively small secretion out of a tree. And one of the things I found most interesting was this creature. And it's too bad we can't have a conversation while I'm talking so I can ask you questions. I want to add what I want to say is, does anyone know what this is? And so some of you or many of you might know this is a tardigrade. And the tardigrade is an extraordinary little creature. It can survive almost anything, including the radiation from outer space. And it's been found that over the last 60 years, they found 3 tardigrades in amber. This becomes extremely important because what scientists really want to know is how the tardigrade evolved to be able to withstand these extreme environmental pressures. They've been found in boiling springs underwater. They can live almost anywhere. They just need a tiny bit of moisture to live. And in the absence of the moisture, they can, this is really wild, they can vitrify. They actually turn into glass. Then when they're rehydrated, they are reanimated and come an extraordinary survival strategy that the tardigrade offers up. And so the fact that they found 3 of these tardigrades in amber and have been able to study them gives them an extraordinary window into understanding the evolutionary history, because you can, if the DNA is not too damaged, you can extract DNA from the tardigrade, but you can also study its morphology, its shape. And 3 tardigrades is not a very big data set, but it's way better than nothing. And so there's always an ongoing quest. Specimens that will tell us something about the present and the future. And really, ultimately, these things are only curiosities unless they can be used as a tool to tell us something useful now. They've got to have something functional we can learn from them. So the tardigrade is one of the stories. It's also really a remarkable cultural touchstone for a lot of people. It's been used to ward off evil spirits. It's been of great veneration and interest to cultures around the world for centuries and centuries, partly because it exists around the world. And like innocent witches, it sinks in most cases, but some of it floats. And so you can find it along seashores, you can find it inland. It's everywhere. It's not quite there for the taking, as it were, but it's everywhere, and it's of great scientific interest. So in some ways, a lot of these tree stories are about the things that trees produce as well as the trees themselves. Because you can't really ignore the byproducts of trees. In a sense, they're a part of the tree as much as the tree, right? From my take. Okay. The longleaf pine is another one of my species, and it's really generally found in the American Southeast, close to the coast, but not always. It pushes inland into Texas and other regions further north. And it's an extraordinary tree in that it is pyrophilic. That is, it needs fire to germinate. It won't germinate without fire that will open up its pod and release its seeds. And in there hangs the tail. I went on a prescribed burn. And of course, fire out here in the American West is it's a very tendentious issue, and it's a complicated one because we have these massive forest fires out here because no one's ever done things like prescribed burns to a degree that will help thin out the forest without destroying it. So I was interested in that. I went on a burn in North Carolina, right on the bleeding edge of the pandemic. I think I was playing for the Huntington, and my best friend happened to live in Pinehurst, and 45 minutes away from the Raleigh-Durham area. And so I went down with him. He's involved with a group called the Sandhill Pines Association. We went on a prescribed burn. And then that afternoon, I got an email from the Huntington saying, you can't travel. You gotta you got to come home, which seemed kind of contradictory. I said, am I supposed to walk home? How do I get back to Southern California? And he said, you can fly. So I hopped on a plane right then, got home, and didn't travel for the next year or two. So the longleaf pine really is a story, and it's a story not just about this extraordinary chlorophyll quality of the tree, but it's really about all the conservation work that's gone into protecting the tree as a kind of alliance. And you can see the title is Understory Alliance, and it's really it's really about the alliance between all the different regional, federal, local, and very grassroots, so to speak, organizations that have kept it alive and well. It's down, I think it's lost 90% of its range in the past century and a half to 2 centuries. It was used for naval stores because of the pitch and the tar that it could make. So it was used to boats and for medicinal purposes and all the other things that and pitch are used for. And so, but it's also an ecological story about the different, what are called commensals, all the different organisms that the tree uses and that use the tree. Pictures of it here. There's a good shot of trees. Here's a guy named Jesse Wimberly, who is very much the subject of this chapter. He's the head of the group that does these prescribed burns. I will tell you, it's absolutely terrifying to walk out into a forest and then set it on fire, which is exactly what they do. They have a water truck. They have special fans mounted on people's backs to kind of direct and blow the wind in different directions. But it was really quite an odyssey. Okay, the East Indian sandalwood tree, again, is something of a story of the product that it produces. But it's also a cultural and political story about how desirable this tree is to people who go to extraordinary lengths to try to secure it. This epigraph here is the longest epigraph in the book by far. And you can see Eric, the illustrator's worked up a sort of bespoke illustration showing the fragrance of the oil, along with a little bit about its medicinal values. One of the most striking things I found out about the tree is urgently they feel the need to protect it from poachers, is because for people who are very poor in India, getting a hold of a tree like this would be a major financial coup. And so they're protected, and you can see here they're protected by a cage. They're protected by those bands or those concrete posts, and a brick wall. And some of them have touch sensors. Some of them have barbed wire around them. There are security dogs and security dogs, guard dogs, and security guards in some places to watch over the tree. So, and I always find it interesting to try to get a hold of the things I'm writing about. So I bought a small vial of this essential oil, which means it's undiluted and undistilled, just to see what it's like. And I have a little thing where I offer up my interpretation of what that smell actually is. And I think if you scaled up that bottle to like an 8-ounce cup, it'd be like $9,000 or something. It's very, very expensive because it's very much in demand. And despite scientific advances and work with, artificial synthetic compounds, they've just not been able to reproduce the smell, and certainly not the medicinal qualities of the oil to a degree that people would find, suitable. So ebony is an extraordinary wood, and I wanted to talk about some kind of ebony tree, and finally settled on this particular one, Crassiflora, Diospyros crassiflora. And it's ebony is so heavy. Most species of ebony will sink in water. They're so heavy. Here's a shot of ebony seedlings and some ebony plants. This is very much a story about Taylor Guitars, which was a guitar company that's located here in Southern California, in San Diego. Taylor Swift plays a Taylor guitar. They're a big concern, and they have a director of environmental conservation. So he pointed out to me that they received an award, a presidential award some years ago for their planting and replanting and sort of management, crop management for the trees. One of the things that they discovered with this tree was that The black ebony, not all of the ebony tree is black. And you can see this not very well, I'm afraid, in this image here, but this center section often is where it's black, and then the rest of it is often striped. It's got a variegated color. And people playing guitars really only wanted the black wood until the guitars thought up the brilliant marketing idea of marketing the striped wood as more desirable than the black wood. So that saved them a lot of loss of wood, because if you're just trying to extract the black wood out of and it takes up just 10% of the tree, you're wasting the other 90% of the tree, of the wood. So they thought up this idea, and it seems to have been successful. Tonal quality of the guitars didn't change, and they were probably more beautiful with this striped wood than with this black wood. Excuse me. Chapter 8 is about the blue gum eucalyptus, which is in some ways very much a Southern California story. Which shows up here during the California gold rush. It's widely planted from nurseries, and it's everywhere, and it smells nice, and it's beautiful. It's also loathed by a lot of people because it's very messy. So it really interrogated the distinctions between the love and the hate that people seem to have for this tree in kind of the same spaces. And you can see that epigraph speaks to that. Humans are strange that way, full of contradictions. It's as if they need to hate and exclude as much as they need to love and embrace. Doors closed tightly, then open at full stretch, only to clench again like an undecided fist. And I can't recommend this book enough, The Island of Missing Trees. It's not so much about the trees, but it kind of is. Leaf Shafak, really a great book. One of the other things about the blue gum is that even though it's an introduced species, it's home to the monarch butterfly, and it provides a necessary respite for butterflies that are from Oregon all the way down into their breeding grounds down in Mexico. The other thing they serve is as a windbreak, and you can see that they've had a really major impact as a windbreak on different regions where they're planted as an adjunct to agriculture. Chapter 9 is about the olive tree. And again, this one really is as much about the products of the olive tree and its fruit and oil. I want to read a little bit out of this bit here. People are always talking about such and such and such a species grows everywhere but Antarctica. People say that kind of all the time. I thought I would play with that a little bit. I open this chapter by saying, you will not find the olive tree on every continent. Olives and olive oil are found on every continent, including Antarctica. To confirm their presence there, I wrote to Tom Senti, who manages the provisioning of the food for McMurdo Station in the Antarctic. McMurdo is the largest year-round human settlement on the continent. Olive oil flows like wine there. In the course of a year, the station's commissary uses more than 180 gallons. McMurdo's population, highly transient, ranges from between 150 and 900 people, depending on the time of year. When you're stuck in a vast, tree-free tract of wind-driven ice and snow, you need good olives and their oil. Green, black, and Kalamata olives are the three varieties usually on hand. Olive oil and olives are also a staple for their pizza station, which bakes up to 16,000 to 18,000 pizzas annually. I'll say that one of the things I found most engaging about writing this book is the people you get to talk to about these. I talk to certified olive oil tasters. They're like wine tasters, except they are certified to taste and grade olive oil. I talk to people that have climbed the coast redwoods and to the top of the trees. I talk to people that are ecologists that have worked with the trees and been working to kind of tease out some of the mysteries for these trees. So talking about them and talking with people about the trees is at least as much fun as the writing, which is also fun. It also adds all sorts of color. My writing, I write in a very journalistic way so that I can tell stories. This is a olive bonsai tree. It's from the Huntington, so we have an exceptional collection of bonsai. Incidentally, I don't know how many of you have been to the Huntington before, but it is a remarkable place. It's 207 acres of botanic gardens, a renowned research, an art museum, and then a renowned research library. We give out 150 fellowships a year for full-time study, ranging from a month to a year. We're the largest fellowship granting library in the United States. And there are 15 curators, 16 curators, each of us with a subject. specialty, so it's a big place. But having the botanic gardens nearby was really my secret weapon for working on the book, because can't really ask a busy curator. I met the bonsai curator and he showed me around and we talked at great length, but you can't really ask someone, we read this whole chapter on my book and tell me any terrible botanical errors. So much work for people. So what I would do is I'd send them a paragraph at a time and say, we read this paragraph and tell me if there's something wrong about this contextually or the implication. And so it's helped me, I think, avoid, no one has yet to point out any really egregious botanical errors, I'm happy to say. So the olive tree really is a great cultural story. And I spent a lot of time working up distinctions between olive and wine, because wine gets better with age, olive oil gets worse with age, and you need to drink it right away. And so, but writing about food is always fun. So that's the olive tree. Sure. Chapter 10 is the baobab tree, which you might be familiar with, this elephantine tree. The baobab can store something like 20,000 gallons of water in its trunk for reasons that we still don't really understand that well. It's native to the African continent and also to the southern Arabian Peninsula of all places. In both places for thousands of years. It's the most widespread tree species in the Huntington genus, which is where it lives taxonomically. And really, it's been known as the tree of life for thousands of years because of its fruits and its seeds have been a food source for centuries. This really is a story about endangered species versus endangered species and how complicated the calculus can be. So the endangered African elephant often will gore the baobab tree's trunks in order to get the water in its tissues. It's not like a regular tree. It doesn't grow tree rings. It's a mass of tissue, a parenchymatous tissue. And so the elephants gore this tree for sustenance, which helps them very much. It's very bad for the trees. So fewer elephants means healthier baobabs. More elephants means less healthy baobabs. They're both endangered. How do you work out the calculus for that? So I take that particular issue on because, endangerment is never a simple matter. There are always confounding factors. Sometimes when something is endangered, it makes something else. When you try to protect something, it makes something else endangered. And I have many examples of that outside of the context of trees. I found that tension really interesting. They're also quite beautiful. They've been called the Rorschach tree. There's a good photo that illustrates that. The Rorschach tree or the upside down tree because it looks so much like a series of roots that are the other thing that I think is interesting about trees is they just show a lot of wear and tear if they're old, as old things do, as old people do, as old organisms do of all kinds. And this applies to the coast redwood, but sometimes they'll just fall over and keep growing. It'll be resting against another tree. I find there's a lovely metaphor for that. The eucalyptus tree sheds more and more as it gets older. The baobab trees get looking like this as they get older. What's the other tree? The bristlecone pine certainly looks like a survivor. Sometimes it's often bent nearly parallel to the ground because of the wind that it has to confront. And then the bald cypress is a remarkable tree, and I just love all these different environmental settings. And I talk a fair amount or a bit about Henry David Thoreau in the course of this book because he has a lot to say about swamps and wetlands. And we have the first 7 drafts of Walden here at the Huntington, to say. I'm sad for East Coast institutions, but I'm happy in pencil. He had terrible handwriting, so scholars have spent a lot of time going over these 7 drafts of Walden. One of the things that I find most interesting about this particular tree is that it's salinity tolerant because it lives in areas where they're close to the ocean, but as storm surges and the rise of tide, the sea level rise starts to impact these trees because the water becomes saltier and saltier and saltier. And so all this potential intrusion from salinity due to these rising sea levels really is one of its most substantial threats. And so there are all these studies underway that are seeking to increase the tree's salinity resistance, its resistance to salt. And they've taken these what are called endophytes. They're fungi and bacteria to inoculate these trees to try to improve their saline resistance. And it seems to be working okay. What they really want is for these trees to take up, for these endophytes to take up long-term residence in the root systems of these trees. And so it's a relatively natural solution. And so again, what constitutes natural is something else I try to interrogate throughout the course of the book. Here's some of them in their native habitat, as it were. They're really beautiful trees, and they're usually in quiet, serene places, it's awfully hard to develop wetlands. You can. It's one of the reasons these trees have survived the way they have is because they're protected. And of course, a lot of wetlands are now protected because they harbor many different species of many different kinds. Let's see, the last tree in the book is the ceiba tree. Ceiba pentandra is its scientific name. It's found on the South American continent. And I was interested in this because, again, it's a little bit of a bookend to the post-redwood, which is the biggest tree on the North American continent. The ceiba tree is everywhere. This is also by far the most personal chapter of the book. I find that as a reader myself, I have a limited tolerance for people whose storytelling about their own lives gets in the way of the things they're talking about. But that said, I really injected myself into the story substantially. You can see from this illustration that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 of us plus a driver, as it were, in the back of in a boat. And so I was in Peru. I was on a bachelor party with a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine. We didn't all know each other, but they are all good friends of his. And so we met up in Peru for a 2-week trip to look for harpy eagle nests, because who doesn't do that during a party, right? We found 2 of them. One of them was a site that no white people have ever visited, apparently. Very, very, very remote civilization, which made me happy. And so I got to spend a lot of time with this tree and telling the story of this tree. And as I said, it's the most personal in the book. Here's a shot of me at the base of one of the ceiba trees. You get a sense for enormous its buttressed roots are, and you can sort of extrapolate up all this tree. It really is very large. I've got my rubber boots on, which are kind of de rigueur for walking around in a jungle. And then I have an epigraph that I wrote that seemed like an important, in some ways, a lot of this work reflects my interest in books. And for instance, the bristlecone pine, I talk a lot about how tree rings are a lot like books. You can read them forwards and backwards. You can think of the rings as pages in a book. And by the same token, I don't have good shots, but by the same token, the bristlecone pine is actually stored in slabs on library shelves. But to that end, I wanted to talk a little bit in this very brief afterword about why it's important to keep track of these things. And sort of the subtext in a way is, well, it's really a record keeping and a library story in some ways. And I'm going to read a little bit, if you don't mind. We record so that we can remember, plan, act, and memorialize. Without evidence, we forget our successes, our failures, and our germinating ideas. This is a collective form of remembering, but not a static one, for gathering knowledge moves science forward. The dozens of people detailed in this book have come to know trees and their past, presents, and futures in very large part through record keeping. Oral traditions are resonant with elegance and can provide essential records from long ago, but the written record is different. Perhaps you played the whisper around the campfire game and you were given a short phrase to breathe quietly into the ear of your neighbor, who passes it to their neighbor until it arrives at the last person in the circle. The final product is frequently unintelligible. 4-corner documents, and now their electronic counterparts, give a stable footing. They allow for nuance at the same time that they support precision, reflection, and doubling back on an idea. I'm reading this off my screen, but there's a line in there that I didn't put in there that I got a chance to quote Octavia Butler in here, and Octavia Butler's papers are here at the Huntington. She's a great deal to say about craft as well as about, she was a science fiction writer who won MacArthur for work for a book called The Parable of the Sower and other ones. Here's the bit I wanted to find. There's a reason that memory is a slippery rascal and evidence can be hard to come by. There's a reason that courts have stenographers and students get grades and undercover agents wear wires. Be a documenter, outline and write and draft and draw and assemble. Keep track of the world. The planet's stories are all told in parts. Leave a record for the future as our progenitors have done for us. Record keeping has gotten us where we are today. So in some ways, that is a through line throughout the book. And I think that's all I have to say. And so I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
So we have a question. Marcia says, I suspect that your list of trees was originally longer when you began your research. How did you decide which trees not to include? And I would add, what's on the cutting room floor?
I get asked that maybe more than anything else. Like how did you pick these 12 trees and why didn't you pick other ones? What didn't you pick? I had a lot of choices. Obviously, there are 13,000 species of trees. I got a letter yesterday from somebody who said, why didn't you include the koa tree? And the snappy answer I wanted to give him was, because there are a lot of trees out there that are very worthwhile trees. The koa tree would have been a good one. I'm from Hawaii, of course, and it would have been a chance to talk about it. But they had to be, what I wanted was a set of trees I could craft that were geographically distinct. So there's very little overlap in the territory of these 12 trees. They're either chronological dispersal or a geographical dispersal. So for instance, the extinct tree is obviously not anywhere now. So, but one of the analogies I've taken to using is, imagine yourself at a party, dinner party, some kind of gathering, and there may be a couple hundred people. Probably considered a couple hundred trees in the course of trying to winnow these down. And some of these people at the party are loud and messy. Some are quiet and elegant. Some are elegantly coiffed. Some are standing quiet in the corner. Others are sort of up in your face, talking you up. And I wanted stories that spoke to me in different kinds of ways. I don't know if that's a little too ephemeral to really hang your hat on, but I wanted things that I could understand and have a different kind of relationship with, I suppose, is a way to think about it. And so, in some cases, it was just luck. Because there's no way to investigate all 13,000 trees, right? You have to just make some decisions and then decide if you're going to stick with them. I had a couple of trees that I'm not sure I can even remember what they were, that I actually started the book off with. And then after a couple of months, I thought, this is not working for what I want to say about those trees. So they fell by I'd like to remember them. They were similar. Like I had a tree on the South American continent. It was big and interesting, and I let it go for reasons I can't recall. Another different fossil tree than the one I ended up picking. I really wanted to talk about how trees were once, that I had a line in the book at one point said, that whiff of petroleum you get when you fill up your car is perhaps a remnant of such and such a tree. But then a paleontologist informed me that trees don't really make up very much of the petroleum products. So I had to let that one go. Really in some ways, as I think I said in the foreword of the book, they really in some ways found me as much as I found them.
Yeah. And this is a little out of order, but I want to read a sentence that really stood out to me that I think that will resonate with others on this call and with the person who asked that question. And this is in the Coast Redwood section. It says, every species of tree offers lessons to the world, both humanistic and scientific, and they all fill the space between those often arbitrary poles.
Yes.
And I feel like that, that's part of the answer to how did you pick these, is that there are so many and it's this amazing spectrum of stories to tell. And I really, as someone who works on art and science and ways they're really connected rather than separate, that really resonated with me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that I forged a relationship of some kind with each of these trees during my initial investigations, and those two poles, sort of humanistic and scientific. I mean, we all have relationships with things around us. Sometimes they're careless and fleeting. Sometimes they're solid. But really, I suppose in a sense, these trees, something about them my attention, and I like them. I think it's safe to say I like them all very much, even though they're all very different. And so some trees, I suppose it's like speed dating. Like, I just couldn't generate enough enthusiasm for some of these trees to want to write about them. It just didn't seem to have that much in common with me, or whatever that means. And I'm working on this new book about extinction, the history of extinction. I've got a couple of trees in that, which I'm very excited about.
Oh, so that leads to our next question, where Doug's wondering if you could tell us briefly about your other books, including your upcoming book, and that he found 12
Sure.
Trees to be a wonderful read.
Thank you. I'll try to keep this kind of brisk because I've written 4.8 books now. But the first one was my doctoral dissertation. It's on railroads in South America, on a particular railroad in Mexico. I'm trained as a Latin Americanist. The greatest praise I've ever gotten for any of my books was about that book. Some guy came up to me at a conference. He said, "I've been reading your railroad book." He said, "I'm not that interested in trains." He said, "But I love the way you write." And so I keep coming back to that book over and over again. Like, who doesn't love to hear that as a writer? And then, I've had birdie obsessions for a long time. And so my next book was a book called The Feathery Tribe, which was about Robert Ridgway, who was the Smithsonian's first curator of birds. It took me probably 10 years to write that thing off and on because I had lots of other things going on. Starting a family, I was engaging with my Huntington work, and I had many other things to do. But over the course of the decade, I wrote this book about Robert Ridgway, and just found that a very interesting. It's really the only biography I've written of anybody. The next book was called Belonging on an Island, Birds, Extinction, and Evolution in Hawaii, which is where I'm from. I was born and raised in the territory of Hawaii 3 weeks before it became a state. And in some ways, it's a really kind of imperfect love letter to the islands, because I'll say it wasn't the happiest time of my life. There are things that were very difficult about growing up in Hawaii, but I wanted to talk about Hawaii. I wanted to visit and write about its bird life in particular, and so I did. And then the tree book came along, and it was my first trade press book. And what was exciting about that was not just that I got a much juicier advance, but that I was able to really let my freak flag fly. I could be as journalistic as I wanted. I did not feel constrained by any of the kind of dicta of academic publishing, and I could write how I wanted. And I had a very, very good editor who really kind of reined me in a lot of. He'd say simply, "Too much." He'd put a line through something, "Too much." I came to know exactly what he meant. Too much. Must have said it 40 times in the copy that the manuscript he went over in pen and ink. So those, I think does that manage the question? Those are the books, and then
the
my
next
new book is
0.8.
So so I'm under contract with LiveWrite, which is a W.W. Norton imprint, for a book 0.8. It's maybe even 0.9. It's shocking how fast this thing is coming along. For a book called Lost: A Biocultural History of Extinction, which is a topic I've been interested in for a long time. It shows up in the Hawaii Bird Book. I teach a course on the history of extinction at Caltech. So my agent finally convinced me that what I really need to do is write a broad global history of extinction. It's so much fun. And who knew that writing about extinction could be fun? But it really is. I mean, it's not as hopeless a story as you might think, but it's about the different ways we've understood and misunderstood extinction over the last 1,000 years. And I've learned a lot about many different organisms, and it's been super fun.
Yeah, I'm excited to. I think that one of our first conversations was about the dodo. So, and,
that's right, Megan. Right.
The dodo, played a starring role in my own research, and so I'll definitely look forward to that one. And so our next question is from Matthew, and I feel like he's really just asking who's your favorite child. So what is your favorite tree?
That's akin to the questions I get asked here in my Curator. What's your favorite book? I get that a lot. What's your favorite book in the collections? And I've kind of worked up an answer that I find satisfactory to that. Darwin's Origin of Species, the first edition. Favorite tree? I really honestly don't know if I could say. It might be the bristlecone pine, just because it leads off the book, and it's probably that and the cluster redwood have generated the most interest. I think oh my gosh, I was on Ari Shapiro's All Things Considered show the day the book came out, which was kind of terrifying. I think they get 12 million people a week to listen to that show. And he had a lot of questions about that and about the coast redwood, about the bristlecone pine. So they're sort of seared into my cerebral cortex. It's been great fun. I've been on radio shows all around the world to talk about this book, and live and recorded, and given many talks in person and remotely. And it's a lot of fun. It's just a very engaging topic. I think it's true to say that everybody loves trees. I don't know anybody that hates trees, even ones that have been used for bad purposes. You know, love the tree, hate the tree user, or something maybe, because all sorts of pernicious things have been done with trees. But answer the question.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so. And then and I can send you a link, Matthew, later too. But can you restate the name of the tree ring or institute in Tucson?
It's the LTRR, or the Laboratory for Tree Ring Research. If you Google LTRR Tucson, it'll come right up. They've got a pretty good website. The other thing I would recommend, there's a woman named Valerie Trouet there, Trouet, who's written her own book. See if I can find it here. This is it. No, it's okay. Here it is. She's making a plug for somebody else's book, but it just came out from Greystone Books, and it's actually an edited collection of books about old trees. And but she's a dendrochronologist with the LTRR, and she was also very helpful. She's that rare scientist who's really a very good writer.
So
Yeah.
I guess I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I think I was really struck and I really enjoyed the kind of journalistic style, as you called it earlier. And I wonder if, and maybe it sounds like, even your dissertation was more kind of, was nicer prose than mine, maybe. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that kind of transition from, you work in an amazing, very scholarly, very footnote oriented field at a very, prestigious, and then to kind of make that transition to a trade press and a more journalistic style.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've written other things for other outlets, articles and things that were quite a bit looser rhetorically than books. I had worked that muscle, and I was an English and creative writing major as an undergraduate. But I think if you're really interested, I'm really interested in storytelling, and it's hard to be a good storyteller and read your work back to yourself as a good story if you're too candid about it or too didactic about it, And so, I find that I want to write somewhat like I talk when I'm talking conversation with people about these things. But of course, the benefit of writing is then you can hone your language and you can make it a craft about it. And so, but I think the storytelling aspect is a really important one in terms of how to succeed. And now I give advice to lots of people, like, how do I make my academic book how do I reach a wider audience through the trade press? And I have lots of advice for people about that. You have to read widely. You have to really read people who write like you would like to write, perhaps. Not that you want to be a slavish imitator of their writing, but you want to learn how to follow their sort of rhetorical meandering, if it is meandering, route to explication and discussion and revelation.
Yeah. I know there's some, PSU's mostly undergraduate programs at this point, and I know there's some undergrads here, but I feel like that's like advice that students, should hear and think about, just the kind of importance of, yes, making sure you're, diligent about your research, but also how to make your work accessible, which is something, in curating I'm thinking about all the time, and I think it's very different than what we're sort of trained in a kind of PhD program. So thanks for that.
I mean, I think it's important to be fearless, as much as you can. Be brave about writing. And there's a book by Annie Lamott called Bird by Bird about writing that I highly recommend. And I'm going to swear on your show for a second here. One of my favorite chapters is one of her dicta is write shitty first drafts. Like, get it down, put it down on paper. Don't be afraid to start because you've got some perfectionist impulse that's holding you back. Let that go. Don't listen to that voice. Get something down on paper, and then that's the germ of things. And of course, it's also a journey of ideas, and you've got to have ideas that you can then use as a scaffolding to write around. You can write a beautiful bit of writing around a solid idea, right? If you think about it as scaffolding and then cladded with, with language that you'll find, you've got to be satisfied with your own writing. And there are many, many, many good books on writing out there, but it takes practice, and you want to get other people's eyes on your writing. You want to get opinions from people about stuff that people whose opinions you can trust, who can give you, bad news as well as good news, and who you really understand have your back. And that's really important. You don't want someone who is going to undermine you or turn on you. someone you trust to look at your writing is a big, really big help.
Yeah. Thanks. So Eden has a question. I don't know if you can answer it. About a tree that they heard about when they were living in Egypt, that they were told was one of the few native trees to the area, that was called the sarsua in Arabic, that had but she's wondering if you're familiar with that tree and if you know what its name is in English.
No idea. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. We'll have to keep looking. So it's just after 6. I really, again, just so appreciate your saying yes to my email this summer and sharing your work with us and your enthusiasm for these amazing 12 species of trees, and just the kind of wonderful blending of humanistic inquiry with scientific discovery, and a real impassioned call for thinking about species loss and thinking about our impacts. And it was just it's been really wonderful to read. So
Megan, thanks so much.
Great to talk with you tonight as well. Thanks so much for your time.
Megan, thank you so much, and thanks to you all. Even though we've never met and may never meet, I appreciate your interest in the hand.